every guy, if we're honest with ourselves, ask a core set of questions throughout our life. Am I man enough? Am I good enough? Do I have what it takes? And how will I know? And our world has all sorts of confusion about what makes a real man, which makes asking those questions really, really complicated. For some people, a real man is this kind of rugged outdoorsman who has all the sports vernacular and six-pack abs and drives a big truck. For others, a real man is someone who's sensitive and aware. They understand their emotions. Maybe they cry at commercials. Or for some, a real man is someone with leadership capabilities or is good in bed. Like, what makes a real man? That can be so confusing, and so often we struggle to find the answer to that. We want to be the right kind of father, husband, friend, brother, coworker, and yet we have a hard time getting our arms around what it looks like to be the kind of person that we're supposed to be. And a lot of times we feel all sorts of pressure from all sides. We have pressure to be a good husband, pressure to be a good father, pressure to be a good coworker or a friend or a teammate. And it can cause us at times, I think, to want to escape, to jump into the man cave and just chill and just relax.
Come on, man.
You know, it's okay to have alone time and to just chill out, but we can't use the man cave to just escape. Last week, we talked about how as men, we're called to fight, but we're called to fight for the right things. We're called to fight in God's strength, not in our own power. So it's okay to go to the man cave, but a real man ultimately is not about escaping. It's about diving into the things that God calls us to. It's about living the kind of life that He wants us to. And it's about not being afraid to jump in and tackle the hard things of life. But it's also not about power. The world kind of paints this picture that a real man is a man with power. A real man is a man with control. Come on, man. We know that that's not the case. We know that just exerting power and trying to exert control, it doesn't make a real man. There's all sorts of jerks who try to control things. There's all sorts of jerks who try to use their power. They're just grown-up boys, giant boys. They're not real men. A guy can sleep with somebody and have a kid. It doesn't mean he's a dad. And so being a real man isn't about power. And to be honest with you, we've seen the abuse of power. We've seen the dark side of power. Think about our politics over the last several years. Think about the hashtag, the Me Too movement, and how many men have used their power, their position, to try to control. And so being a real man, it's not about wielding power. It's about leading.
Come on, man.
Last week, we looked at a target, and we talked about how we need to have a good understanding of what a real man is, but we need to get that picture from God. And God has given us some glimpses of what that kind of real man looks like. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, God called Samuel to anoint a king. But Samuel looked at the king like any of us would. He was looking for the tallest, strongest, best-looking guy. But God had different plans. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7 says this, "But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.'" Well, what makes a real man? You see, we've been fooled to believe that it's all about power, but God looks at things differently. And the life of Jesus shows us differently. Jesus defined greatness as being a servant. In Mark chapter 9, verse 33 through 35, he says this, "They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, What are you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and he said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." The disciples were placing their value, their worth on position, on power, on the pecking order, but it was not about any of those things. Jesus says, no, you got it all wrong. If you want to be the greatest, you need to be willing to serve. And we can get goofed up and begin to live out those same kind of things. That guys love a pecking order. They love to know kind of where they stand. But Jesus says, you want to be the greatest? Be a servant. It's not about power and wielding power. It's about serving others. It's about surrender to Him and to His ways. And that really goes back to our identity. Where do we find our identity and who we are? Is it in the approval of all of these other people? Is it in the power, the position that we have? Our identity needs to be found in a God who says that we're loved, a God who says that we're called to be fighters, to be warriors for Him, to be willing to jump into the fray and to live a life of purpose and meaning. You know, Jesus was a tough guy. He was gentle, but he was tough. He was the ultimate leader. In John chapter 13, verse 3 through 5, it says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power, and that He had come from God and was returning to God. So He got up from the meal, He took off His outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around His waist. After that, He poured water into a basin and began to wash His disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around Him. Jesus was the ultimate leader. And listen, He's a man's man, but He did not use His power to wield control over people. I love what it says in this verse, that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power. So it was all under His power. And that He had come from God and was returning to God. I mean, what more powerful position can you have? But then it says, so He got up from the meal and He washed their feet. Because He knew whose He was, because He knew His identity, He was willing to serve. He didn't have to exert power. He didn't have to wield power. He was a servant leader. And then it says in John 13, verse 12 through 17, when He had finished washing their feet, He put on His clothes and returned to His place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example, that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. He models servanthood for them and calls them to the same kind of leadership. And Jesus took that servant leadership as far as He could possibly take it. Mark 10, verse 45 says this, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give His life as a ransom for many. He's willing to give His life away, and He calls us to the same kind of life. Guys especially, husbands especially. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. What's it saying? It's saying that we need to be willing to sacrifice, to be willing to put the other person first, to be willing to lay down our life for them.
Come on, man.
You know, leading doesn't mean exerting power. We look at Jesus' model, it was servant leadership. So, like in my family, when we make decisions, when we have those hard discussions, it's not about me exerting power or my way. It's not unilaterally making decisions. We're in it together. But in all of those decisions and discussions, I'm called as to be a real man. And being a real man means I need to put their interests first. And so I'm looking to Jennifer and to my boys to say, these decisions that we're making, I want it to be what's best for them. In the discussions and decisions that we make, how can I help them flourish? How can I make decisions so that they will excel and they'll experience their very best life? I want to lift them up. In those moments, you might be wondering, well, when am I going to get the things I want? Like, what does that mean for me? Does it mean I have to sacrifice all of my longings, my hopes, my dreams? No. And yes, because we're called to lead. And as we lead like real men, we're called to be willing to sacrifice. We're called to trust God, that He knows and He cares about those things that we care about. And we're called to live with humility. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5 through 7, it says this: "In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you." In that verse, you notice it says, all of you. We're all supposed to do that together, not just us, but guys, we need to lead the way. We need to be willing to live with humility, to serve the other person. And I love what it says in that verse where it says that when we lead with humility, that God, and we walk with humbleness, that God will lift us up, that He'll take care of us. We're entrusting ourselves to Him. You know, we're called to serve. We're called to lead with humility. We're called to look like Jesus. And when we live that way, we're actually becoming more and more the real man that He's wanting us to become.
Come on, man.
Don't mistake this for some soft, sissified version of manhood. Like, Jesus was no sissy. He was gentle, yes, but He was tough. He was strong. He was a leader. And He wants us to be as well. We're called to action, not to passiveness, not to apathy. We're called to get in the game and lead and be the men that He has called us to be, not for our own power to wield that, but to lead for the sake of others. And my hope is that as you look at this series or this message, that you don't feel like this is one of just like those dozen TV shows or maybe a bunch of messages that you've heard before, like it's some kind of beat men up kind of thing. It's not intended to be that at all. It's intended to be a call to arms, that as guys, we would bring it in those relationships that are so crucial to us, that we would give and love and serve and give our hearts and love like crazy and fight for the right things and have the hard discussions. And at the end of the day, just go to bed tired because we've poured out our hearts to our family and to those closest to us, all to get back up and do it again the next day. Not in our own strength, but depending on God and His strength to do what we can't do on our own. And rather than want to run and escape, that we would be willing to fight for the things that are most important. That we'd be willing to dive in. Let's man up. We can do this. So let's lead and let's serve. Let's lead spiritually. And listen, I know for some of you, that's going to feel really, really awkward. You feel like maybe your wife is further ahead, or you're not sure what you're going to be able to teach your kids because you feel like you don't know that much. But if you will just jump in and do that, maybe it's gathering them together to pray before a meal, and your kids are going to look at you funny, but you're going to say, we're going to do this as a family, and I'm going to be the first one to pray. And even if it feels a little awkward, God will honor it, because He's asking you to be a man who won't just be about wielding power, but instead will lead as a servant. And so would you do that? Would you jump in? Because when you do, no matter what your past has been like, whether you had a great father figure or not, whether you had a marriage to look up to or not, listen, your heritage might not be what you wished it was, but your legacy can be more than you ever dreamed. And you'll have the opportunity for your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids to look back and point to you as the one who turned the corner for their families. That's a real man.
Who's the man?